My name is Chinedu Okafor.
In our last episode of the Nigeria History series, we journeyed through the Northern Protectorate and uncovered how Britain governed northern Nigeria before the amalgamation of 1914. We discovered a land of powerful emirates, thriving trans-Saharan trade, respected Islamic scholarship, and a system of administration that Britain largely preserved through indirect rule. But after completing that research, one question refused to leave my mind. If the Northern Protectorate had such a rich and organized history before Nigeria was created, what was happening at exactly the same time in the south? Were the people governed in the same way? Did they live the same kind of life? Did they have kings like the emirs of the north? Or was southern Nigeria an entirely different world? Those questions led me back into the archives. Once again, I found myself surrounded by old colonial records, missionary journals, handwritten reports, government documents, fading photographs, and maps that had survived for more than a century. The deeper I went, the more fascinated I became. What I found completely changed my understanding of southern Nigeria before the amalgamation. Today, I invite you to travel with me once again, not just to learn history, but to experience it. This is the untold story of the Southern Protectorate. The first discovery surprised me almost immediately. Before the British officially created the Southern Protectorate in 1900, there was no single political entity called Southern Nigeria. Instead, this vast region was home to many independent kingdoms, city-states, republics, and communities, each with its own language, traditions, political system, and way of life. Unlike the north, where large emirates formed powerful centralized governments, the south was incredibly diverse. The mighty kingdom of Benin stood as one of Africa's greatest civilizations, famous for its magnificent palace, skilled bronze casters, disciplined military, and impressive earthworks that amazed early European visitors. Along the Atlantic coast, the kingdoms of Bonny, Opobo, Brass, and Calabar grew wealthy through maritime trade. Their rivers were alive with canoes carrying merchants, fishermen, and travelers from one community to another. Farther inland, many Igbo communities governed themselves through councils of elders, age grades, titled men, women's associations, and open village assemblies. Decisions were often reached through discussion and consensus rather than by the command of a single ruler. Among the Itsekiri, Arobo, Isoko, Ija, Efik, Ibibio, Yoruba communities of the southwest, and many others, every society developed institutions that reflected its own history and environment. As I continued reading, one thing became increasingly clear. Southern Nigeria was never an empty land waiting to be organized by outsiders. It was already filled with thriving civilizations. The geography itself helped shape these societies. Unlike the open grasslands of the north, the south was blessed with dense tropical rainforests, winding rivers, vast mangrove swamps, fertile farmland, lagoons, and one of Africa's most valuable coastlines. The river Niger and its countless tributaries became natural highways, connecting villages, kingdoms, and trading centers long before modern roads existed. For many communities, the river was life itself. It provided transportation, food, trade, communication, and opportunity. As I studied old maps, I imagined hundreds of wooden canoes gliding silently through these waterways every single day. Some carried fishermen returning with fresh catches. Others transported palm oil, smoked fish, carved wood, pottery, woven cloth, and agricultural produce to distant markets. Children learned to paddle almost as soon as they could walk. Families built their lives around rivers that connected them to neighboring communities and even to traders from across the Atlantic. Then I turned my attention to the economy. What sustained the people of southern Nigeria before colonial administration took full control? The answer was astonishing. The land itself was incredibly generous. Farmers cultivated yam, cassava, cocoyam, maize, vegetables, plantains, bananas, and many other crops that fed growing populations. Towering palm trees stretched across enormous forests, producing palm fruits that would eventually become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Long before Europeans recognized its economic importance, local communities had already mastered the processing of palm oil for cooking, medicine, soap making, and trade. Fishing was another pillar of daily life. The rivers, creeks, and coastal waters were rich with fish, crabs, oysters, and other seafood. Fishing was not merely an occupation, it was a way of life passed from one generation to another. Boat builders became highly respected craftsmen, producing sturdy canoes capable of carrying people and goods across vast waterways. Markets were the heartbeat of southern Nigeria. Every market day transformed quiet villages into vibrant centers of commerce. Women spread colorful wrappers across wooden stalls, displaying baskets filled with vegetables, spices, smoked fish, palm oil, pottery, woven baskets, carved sculptures, medicinal herbs, and handcrafted goods. The sound of bargaining filled the air. Children ran happily between crowded stalls. Travelers exchanged stories from distant communities. Merchants formed new partnerships. Markets were not simply places to buy and sell. They were places where news traveled, friendships were formed, marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and cultures met. One discovery especially caught my attention: the enormous role played by women. In many parts of southern Nigeria, women were not only respected members of society, they were the driving force behind local commerce. They controlled large sections of the marketplace. They organized trading networks that connected towns and villages. They managed family businesses, processed agricultural products, and built economic relationships across rivers and regions. Without them, many local economies simply could not function. The more I read, the more I realized that southern Nigeria possessed an energy unlike anywhere else I had studied. Its rivers connected people, its forests sustained communities. Its markets generated wealth. Its diversity encouraged innovation. Its people built societies that reflected centuries of adaptation to their unique environment. But another question soon emerged. If southern Nigeria was already prosperous, if its people were successfully governing themselves, if trade was flourishing, why did Britain become so interested in controlling this region? That answer, I discovered, would change the course of Nigerian history forever. During the 19th century, Britain was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Factories were expanding rapidly. Machines demanded enormous quantities of raw materials. Industrial production required lubricants, soap, candles, and countless manufactured goods. One product suddenly became incredibly valuable: palm oil. The same palm trees that had sustained southern Nigerian communities for generations now became one of Britain's most desired resources. European merchants recognized the opportunity almost immediately. More ships began arriving along the coast. Trading posts expanded. Commercial agreements multiplied. British companies competed fiercely to secure access to palm oil, palm kernels, timber, rubber, ivory, and other valuable exports. The rivers of southern Nigeria became increasingly busy as international trade grew year after year. As I examined old shipping records, one fact became impossible to ignore. Britain's interest in southern Nigeria was never based on curiosity alone. It was driven by economics. The forests held valuable timber. The rivers provided transportation. The ports connected Africa to Europe. The land produced resources that fueled industrial growth thousands of miles away. Every successful trade voyage strengthened Britain's influence in the region. Every commercial agreement laid another foundation for political control. And without fully realizing it, many local communities were witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would eventually reshape their entire society. Little did they know, the arrival of merchants was only the beginning. Soon, administrators would follow. Missionaries would arrive. Colonial officials would redraw boundaries. And the Southern Protectorate would officially be born. That remarkable story is where our journey continues. The more I followed the historical records, the more I realized that trade was only one part of the story. Behind every trading post, behind every merchant, behind every ship sailing into southern Nigerian waters, there was a much bigger ambition unfolding. Britain no longer wanted to simply trade with the people of southern Nigeria. It wanted control. As I dug deeper into the archives, one name appeared again and again: the Royal Niger Company. At first glance, it sounded like an ordinary business. But it was far more powerful than that. The company was granted a royal charter by the British Crown, giving it extraordinary authority to negotiate treaties, establish trading stations, administer territories, and protect British commercial interests along the River Niger and beyond. Imagine a private company exercising powers that today would belong to a government. That was the remarkable position the Royal Niger Company occupied. Its agents traveled from community to community, meeting kings, chiefs, merchants, and local leaders. Some agreements were welcomed because they promised expanded trade. Others were signed under pressure or amid misunderstandings about what the documents truly meant. Whatever the circumstances, Britain's influence steadily expanded. The company established trading depots along important waterways. Warehouses appeared beside rivers. Steam-powered boats became an increasingly common sight. European goods such as cloth, metal tools, mirrors, salt, and manufactured products flowed inland, while palm oil, rubber, timber, ivory, and other resources flowed toward the coast. Trade was changing the landscape. Entire communities began producing more goods for export. River ports grew busier every year. Some towns became prosperous commercial centers, attracting traders from across West Africa. Yet while commerce flourished, another transformation was quietly taking place. Christian missionaries began arriving in greater numbers. Unlike merchants, they came with a different mission. They established churches. They opened schools. They built small medical clinics. They translated religious texts into local languages. Many believed education could improve lives and open new opportunities for future generations. As I read letters written by early missionaries, I noticed that they often described southern Nigeria as a region full of intelligent, hardworking people eager to learn. Mission schools gradually appeared in many communities. Children who had previously learned through traditional family systems now found themselves sitting in classrooms, reading books, writing on slates, and learning new subjects. For many families, education represented hope. Young boys and girls learned to read and write. Some became teachers. Others became interpreters between Africans and Europeans. Some eventually entered the colonial civil service. A new generation was slowly emerging. At the same time, traditional beliefs and customs continued to shape everyday life. Families still gathered beneath ancient trees to settle disputes. Village elders continued guiding their communities. Traditional festivals filled villages with music, dancing, storytelling, and celebration. The old and the new now existed side by side. Neither disappeared overnight. Instead, southern Nigeria entered a period of remarkable transition. Then I reached one of the most significant discoveries in my research. By the end of the 19th century, the British government had become increasingly dissatisfied with the Royal Niger Company. Although the company had expanded British influence, governing such a vast territory through a private business was becoming increasingly difficult. Commercial interests alone could no longer guarantee political stability. Britain wanted direct control. In 1899, the charter of the Royal Niger Company was revoked. Its governing authority came to an end. The following year marked a turning point that would permanently reshape the history of southern Nigeria. On the 1st of January 1900, the British government officially created the Southern Protectorate. For the first time, Britain assumed direct responsibility for administering much of southern Nigeria. However, one important detail immediately caught my attention. Lagos was not initially merged into the Southern Protectorate. It continued to exist separately as the colony of Lagos, administered directly because of its growing commercial and strategic importance. This surprised me. I had always imagined southern Nigeria as a single administrative unit. But the historical documents revealed something much more complicated. There was the Southern Protectorate. There was the colony of Lagos. Each had its own administrative structure, even though both remained under British authority. Gradually, colonial administrators established district headquarters across the protectorate. British district commissioners were appointed to supervise different regions. Government offices appeared in important towns. Maps became more detailed. Boundaries were carefully surveyed. Official records multiplied. Telegraph lines slowly connected administrative centers. River transport expanded to improve communication between distant communities. Watching these developments unfold through old photographs and government reports, I began to understand the scale of Britain's ambitions. This was no longer simply about buying palm oil. It was about building an administrative system capable of governing millions of people spread across forests, rivers, swamps, and coastal settlements. Yet governing southern Nigeria would prove far more challenging than governing the north. The reason became obvious the more I compared both protectorates. In the Northern Protectorate, Britain encountered centralized emirates with established rulers who already exercised authority over large populations. The colonial government could largely work through those existing structures. Southern Nigeria presented an entirely different picture. Some communities had powerful kings. Others were governed by councils. Many Igbo societies made important decisions collectively. Leadership differed from one community to another. There was no single political system that Britain could apply across the entire region. Every district required a different approach. Every community had its own traditions. Every society expected its own customs to be respected. The deeper I went into the records, the more I admired the incredible diversity of southern Nigeria. No two communities were exactly alike. And that diversity, while culturally rich, made colonial administration increasingly complex. As I closed another century-old government report, I realized that Britain had gained administrative control. But governing the South would demand much more than drawing boundaries on a map. It would require understanding societies that had developed over centuries, each with its own identity, leadership, and way of life. Whether the colonial administration truly understood those differences was another question entirely, and that question would lead me into one of the most fascinating chapters of this investigation. How exactly did Britain attempt to govern such a diverse region? The answer revealed a political experiment whose consequences would shape southern Nigeria for generations. As I continued reading through colonial reports and personal diaries, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. The Southern Protectorate was unlike any other territory Britain had governed in West Africa. Its greatest strength was also its greatest complexity. There were hundreds of communities, hundreds of traditions, hundreds of ways of making decisions. For the British administrators arriving from Europe, this presented a challenge they had never fully anticipated. One district might be ruled by a respected king whose authority was recognized throughout the kingdom. The next district could be governed by councils of elders. A neighboring community might rely on age-grade associations, family heads, religious leaders, or village assemblies to settle disputes and make important decisions. There was no single political formula that could be applied everywhere. Unlike the Northern Protectorate, where Britain found a centralized system that made indirect rule relatively straightforward, southern Nigeria required constant adaptation. Every new district demanded fresh negotiations. Every community required careful observation. Every tradition had to be understood before any policy could be introduced. To manage this enormous responsibility, Britain divided the Southern Protectorate into administrative districts. Each district was placed under the supervision of a British district commissioner. These officials became the face of colonial administration in their assigned regions. They traveled by river, canoe, horseback, and on foot. They inspected villages, collected reports, held meetings with local leaders, resolved administrative disputes, and regularly communicated with the colonial government. As I examined photographs from that period, I noticed how isolated many of these officers were. Some worked hundreds of kilometers from the nearest administrative headquarters. Travel through dense forests could take several days. River journeys depended on weather and tides. Communication with Lagos was often slow. Life for both administrators and local communities demanded patience and resilience. But Britain understood that administration alone could not maintain order. It also needed a judicial system. Across many districts, native courts were established. On paper, these courts appeared to combine local customs with colonial administration. In reality, their operation varied greatly from one community to another. In some places, respected traditional leaders continued hearing cases according to long-established customs. Elsewhere, British officials supervised proceedings more closely. Interpreters became essential because many colonial officers could not speak local languages. Clerks carefully recorded judgments in large handwritten registers. Land disputes, marriage disagreements, trade conflicts, inheritance questions, community disagreements. These courts handled matters that affected everyday life. While reading through court records, I found something that fascinated me. Many judgments continued to reflect traditional customs that had guided communities for generations. Even under colonial administration, local traditions remained deeply influential. Yet Britain still faced one major problem. How could it govern communities that had no single ruler? That question appeared repeatedly throughout the documents I studied. The answer the colonial administration eventually chose would become one of the most debated decisions in Nigerian history. In many Igbo communities, leadership was shared. Village assemblies met beneath large trees. Councils of elders discussed important matters. Age-grade organizations carried out community projects. Women's associations protected economic and social interests. Respected title holders offered guidance. Authority belonged to the community rather than to one individual. Consensus was valued. Discussion was encouraged. No one person exercised absolute control. For British administrators accustomed to dealing with kings, chiefs, and emirs, this system was unfamiliar. They often searched for individuals they believed could represent entire communities. In many areas, colonial officials recognized or appointed men to serve as warrant chiefs. These chiefs were expected to work with the colonial administration, supervise local affairs, and help implement government policies. As I read both colonial reports and later historical analyses, it became clear that this approach produced different results in different communities. In some places, cooperation developed. In others, the new arrangements created misunderstanding, disagreement, and lasting tension. Many communities continued to place greater trust in their traditional assemblies than in newly created administrative positions. History reminds us that governing people is never simply about creating offices or signing documents. Successful leadership depends on understanding how communities already function. Another important aspect of colonial administration was taxation. Governments require revenue to build infrastructure, maintain administration, and pay officials. The colonial government therefore introduced systems for collecting taxes in different parts of the protectorate. Tax records were carefully maintained. District officers supervised collection. Clerks documented payments. Revenue supported roads, government buildings, communication networks, and administrative services. But taxation was never viewed in exactly the same way by every community. People naturally asked questions. Why were these payments necessary? Who decided the amount? How would the money be used? These discussions became part of a much broader conversation about authority, responsibility, and governance. The more I researched, the more I realized that southern Nigeria was not simply adapting to colonial administration. It was constantly negotiating with it. Traditional institutions continued to exist. Village assemblies still met. Markets remained active. Families preserved customs passed down through generations. Religious life continued. Festivals were celebrated. Agriculture flourished. Trade expanded. Life did not suddenly stop because colonial rule had arrived. Instead, old traditions and new institutions existed side by side, influencing one another in ways that would shape the future of the region. One photograph held my attention for several minutes. It showed a busy southern Nigerian town. Traditional mud houses stood beside newer colonial buildings. A church rose above nearby rooftops. Children carrying schoolbooks walked past women transporting baskets of produce. Merchants unloaded goods from riverboats while government clerks hurried toward administrative offices. In that single image, I could see two worlds learning to coexist. Neither world completely replaced the other. Instead, southern Nigeria entered one of the most transformative periods in its history. Education expanded. Trade increased. Transportation improved. New opportunities emerged. At the same time, communities worked hard to preserve their identity, languages, customs, and cultural heritage. As I leaned back from my desk and looked again at the growing collection of maps and photographs covering my research wall, one thought stayed with me. The Southern Protectorate was far more than a colonial administrative territory. It was home to millions of people whose daily lives, traditions, achievements, and resilience deserve to be remembered. But despite these remarkable achievements, another chapter of the story was about to unfold. Not every community welcomed every colonial policy. Not every leader accepted Britain's growing influence without question. Across different parts of the Southern Protectorate, voices began to rise. Some chose negotiation. Others defended their authority. Many simply wanted to protect the independence their ancestors had preserved for generations. Those voices would become some of the most important in Nigerian history. And understanding them is essential to understanding how the road to the amalgamation of 1914 was shaped. The deeper I explored this chapter of history, the more I realized something important. History is rarely a story of complete agreement. Whenever great political changes take place, there are always different opinions, different interests, and different responses. The Southern Protectorate was no exception. Many communities welcomed opportunities that came with expanded trade, improved transportation, and access to education. Others became increasingly concerned about the growing influence of the colonial government over their traditional institutions. Every community responded in its own way. That diversity of response is one of the defining characteristics of southern Nigeria's history. As I continued reading, several remarkable names appeared repeatedly in books, government records, and historical accounts. These were individuals who played significant roles during this period of transition. One of the most fascinating was King Jaja of Opobo. Long before the Southern Protectorate was formally established, King Jaja had transformed Opobo into one of the most successful trading states along the West African coast. He understood international commerce. He negotiated with European merchants. He protected the economic interests of his kingdom. His influence demonstrated that African rulers were not merely observers of global trade, they were active participants who shaped it. Another important figure was Nana Alamu of Itsekiri. Like many leaders of his time, he sought to preserve the commercial independence of his people while navigating increasing European influence along the coast. Historical accounts describe him as an experienced merchant and influential leader whose decisions reflected the difficult choices facing many African rulers during an era of rapid change. Then there was the Akimika movement, remembered for its determined efforts to preserve the independence of many Western Igbo communities over several decades. Although different communities adopted different approaches, these events remind us that colonial expansion was not simply a one-sided process. Across southern Nigeria, local leaders continued making decisions they believed would best protect their people, their traditions, and their future. As I reflected on these stories, I realized that history often becomes richer when we move beyond simple narratives. It is tempting to imagine every event as a clear struggle between opposing sides. The reality was far more complex. There were negotiations. There were disagreements. There were alliances. There were misunderstandings. There were moments of cooperation. And there were moments of resistance. Every community experienced this changing world differently. By the beginning of the 20th century, southern Nigeria itself was changing rapidly. Schools continued producing educated young men and women. Churches became established in many towns. River ports expanded. Markets attracted merchants from distant regions. Roads gradually connected previously isolated communities. Telegraph lines improved communication. Government offices became more organized. A new generation emerged, people who could move comfortably between traditional society and the rapidly changing colonial world. Many of them would later become teachers, lawyers, journalists, businessmen, civil servants, community leaders. Some would eventually play important roles in Nigeria's struggle for self-government. The foundations of that future were already being laid during the years of the Southern Protectorate. One evening, while studying an old administrative map, I noticed something that immediately captured my attention. On my wall hung two large maps. One showed the Northern Protectorate. The other showed the Southern Protectorate. I stood quietly for several minutes looking at both. They were administered separately. They differed in geography. They differed in culture. They differed in political organization. They differed in religion. Even their economies developed along different paths. Yet I knew something those maps did not yet reveal. Very soon, both territories would become one country. That realization made me ask another question. Why would Britain decide to unite two regions that were so different? The answer, once again, lay inside the colonial records. Maintaining two large protectorates with separate administrations required enormous financial resources. The Southern Protectorate generated significant revenue through its expanding economy, international trade, ports, and exports. The Northern Protectorate, however, required greater financial support to maintain its administration and infrastructure. British officials increasingly believed that combining both territories under a single administration would improve efficiency, simplify governance, and reduce administrative costs. Economic considerations played a major role in the discussions. Railways could be managed more effectively. Trade routes could be coordinated. Government departments could be reorganized. Administrative expenses could be reduced. As I continued reading official correspondence from the period, I realized that the proposed union was viewed primarily as an administrative solution by the colonial government. For the millions of people living across both protectorates, however, its long-term consequences would be far greater than anyone could fully imagine. Then came the moment that would forever change West African history. On the 1st of January 1914, the Northern Protectorate, the Southern Protectorate, and the colony of Lagos were brought together under one administration. A new political entity emerged. Nigeria. As I looked once again at the two old maps pinned to my research wall, I slowly placed them side by side. For several seconds, I imagined the countless communities represented on both maps. The farmers tending their fields. The fishermen navigating rivers. The traders filling busy markets. The scholars teaching children. The kings. The emirs. The elders. The craftsmen. The mothers raising families. The children who knew nothing of the decisions being made in distant colonial offices. Their lives, languages, customs, and histories had developed over centuries. Now, they found themselves part of one new country. The more I study Nigeria's history, the more convinced I become that understanding our past is essential to understanding our present. Nigeria did not emerge from empty land. It was built upon the achievements of remarkable civilizations that existed long before colonial rule. Every kingdom, every village, every republic, every trading port, every community contributed something valuable to the story we now call Nigeria. Their histories deserve to be remembered. Not because they belong only to the past, but because they continue to shape who we are today. If you've stayed with me throughout this journey, thank you. I hope this documentary has helped you see the Southern Protectorate in a completely new light. If you learned something new today, please support this project by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with friends and family who believe our history should never be forgotten. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I'd also love to know which part of Nigerian history has fascinated you the most so far. Our mission is simple: to build one of the largest digital libraries of Nigerian history, making our past accessible to everyone, especially younger generations who may never have the opportunity to study these stories in school. And our journey is far from over. In our next episode, we begin an exciting new chapter. We'll move beyond the protectorates and the colonial era to examine the men and women who have led Nigeria from the transition out of colonial rule to the present day. One by one, we'll explore their rise to power, the challenges they faced, the decisions they made, their achievements, the controversies surrounding their administrations, and the lasting impact each has had on our nation's story. It's a journey through leadership, vision, triumph, and difficult lessons, one that will help us better understand how Nigeria became the country we know today. Until then, my name is Chinedu Okafor. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth. And never stop discovering the remarkable story of Nigeria.